Hi, I'm Joe Carrero. All this debate about the debt ceiling, deficit spending, and taxes just shows once again how far apart we all are from Congress and from each other. We've allowed ourselves to be broken down into two groups that cannot compromise or come up with solutions basic to the welfare of our country. If you're a Democrat, you'll defend the party position of raising taxes and diminish spending cuts to resolve our debt crisis. And if you're a Republican, you'll defend that party position of no tax hikes and across-the-board spending cuts, even including Social Security and Medicare. And if we're not controlled by our party, we've allowed ourselves to be typecast and stereotyped into such broad and misunderstood labels as conservatives and liberals that not only mean different things to those belonging to those brands, but many times have completely different meaning in other parts of the world. But the powers that be require that we distinguish ourselves so that we have less opportunity to unite for the good of our country and ourselves. Are people so weak that they'll continue to treat everything as a black and white issue, remaining in lockstep, supporting whatever political parties or special interest groups tell them how to think? Of course, those that don't just follow orders from a political perspective and rather use their own personal values and ideologies to conclude what's best for them in our country will then hear the threats about how all the checks that aren't going to get issued if the government defaults on paying its debts, as Congress goes on another of its vacations. The reason Congress gets away with all this stuff is that they know they're in control because they'll either get your compliance with the loyalty to your party or the fear of not getting a Social Security check or getting laid off or worse yet, causing our country's demise. The first place to stop this madness or submission to the will of Congress is to make sure you put things in their proper order and perspective. Our first loyalty needs to be for the well-being of our country, and then political ideology. When you put your political party first, you're allowing them to make your values and ideological decisions for you. And we see where that misplaced trust has gotten us. We become mindless again to our position as citizens of the greatest political experiment in the history of the world. I say again, because all we have to do is just look back in our history to a period we never thought we'd revisit. It was in the mid-1800s with 99% of our citizens struggling while helping to expand and build a country. There were people searching for a livelihood that brought about business startups in urban settings and settlements taming the wild. It was a time of capitalism in a true small business sense. But there were also people starving to death. Unbelievable infant mortality, and due to lack of medical care, many dying from diseases or even simple wounds caused by accidents. But while everyone's needs weren't being met, there was growth and increasing employment, bringing prosperity to those in charge. While it was a much more primitive time in our country's history, there was the 1% of the population flourishing and creating enormous wealth that was passed on to many future generations. Their success, as well as their greed and corruption, became enhanced because they managed the politics of our country. The rest of the folks were too busy surviving to worry about who was controlling their lives or even if they had any right to object to such power. It was a two-class system with 1% in charge and 99% following along, barely making it, without having the right to question how this great country that was established to allow for the equal pursuit of happiness could evolve to being a serfdom for those unequal. And it was perfectly described in Orwell's book, Animal Farm, that all the animals were equal. It was just the time that some were more equal than others. Then in 1848, a woman questioned why she could not share in this country's political destiny. And then another woman demanded the right to vote. And then another woman and another. Kind of sounded like how the Tea Party formed with that small group of women becoming a powerful voice. Then came a war unlike any other, followed by an outcry for people of color to be allowed to vote, and given that right in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. The problem in that political landscape, though, is that it began to change ever so slightly as those in power still controlled the effects of the new laws and limited participation in the political process. And they were allowed to continue this manipulation by the many good people who mindlessly stood by and followed and watched. That's why it took another 50 years to get those in power to succumb to the granting of voting rights to women in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment to our Constitution. For all those years, those political powers and parties controlled the lives of those disenfranchised peoples. those in charge of our country made the decisions that brought them the wealth and influence granted by our political system, while most of the country just got along and went along, with a few standing up for what they believed our country stood for. It then took another 45 years to outlaw the discriminatory voting practices against those same people of color by passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, primarily because of the actions of those both black and white who took to the streets and could no longer stand mindlessly by and watch as the Reverend Martin Luther King started his movement of freedom and equality for all. It was then we experienced a great society, not because of the economic tools provided by President Johnson or the Congress, but because all the people had the right to control their political destiny and vote to make sure that they were treated fairly and with equal opportunity. That's how our economy flourished, and how our middle class was drawn from that 99% who previously was struggling so that the 1% making the political decisions could thrive. All that time spent building the path to security and stability with a spirit ensured by a political process of one man, one vote, created a thriving middle class. But that now has now again seemed to be destroyed by big business, big unions, and big government, all in a conspiracy with a big political party or parties given their power by the very people who they were crippling economically, since their vote has been taken for granted to the point of having no meaning other than offering those powerful parties permission to be in total control of the decisions that determine our future. If we want to again be loyal to our Constitution and take the governing of our country back to where we truly had a sense that we were in charge of our destiny and had to give our consent of how to be governed, we need to unite and think as a country without worrying about the threats of the sky falling. We need to start by putting Congress, their staffs and benefits and perks first in line to be cut when searching for places to save money. We need to stop them from being controlled by the benefactors feeding their expensive habits. That should have been done a long time ago. But how come we never heard that before? It's because the debate has always been steered away from affecting those who run our government as well as those in the big businesses of corporations and unions who pay for those running our government. If you view my videos on Congress's contract with the American people and the lobbyists that pay Congress, you'd see what they take for themselves and who pays them. And if you still have any doubts who got us in this current horrible mess of losing so much of our middle class and creating a 99% that can only see itself struggling in the future, it was the most recent presidential administrations and Congresses that caused the financial and housing crises and lax enforcement of regulations, which then helped out the interests of those industries. And it began long before Barack Obama created billions in stimulus packages that helped his campaign contributors. And it all started before his enhancement of TARP and bailouts that began as George W. Bush, who, with a majority of Congress, increased spending in our debt with programs benefiting industries which were heavy contributors to Bush's campaign and both political parties, as well as most members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. Those are just a couple of highlights that brought us to where we are today. My video, Bush to Obama, has an interesting look at that history. And today, these folks continue stealing us blind, even though we now all have the right to vote. In the past, the excuse was that the law was on their side. Now, there is no excuse. We all have the right to vote to keep those weak-kneed, intellectually and ethically challenged folks in office, or think about what they're doing to our country and each of us individually, and petition to get them out right now. But these Democrats and Republicans have gotten away with overspending and unfair tax breaks because they discovered a long time ago that the public can be led to believe that their elected officials in Washington will look after their interests as long as it's presented as being opposite to the opposition. So they believe that you'd be willing to cut off your nose to spite your face if your party tells you it has to be done to stop the other party from accomplishing their goals, which just might be a benefit to your country. So all you Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals and Tea Partiers and occupiers, don't allow those in power to continue to define for you what loyalty to your country means. To them, it means giving up your freedoms and liberties that were used for self-determination to become mindless supporters of their welfare. And remember, they have to keep us divided to be able to keep draining our country's wealth. So stay alert, folks, and decide for yourself what's right for our United States of America. and your own well-being. And maybe even start voting that way. I think you'd have a better idea than a party insider who has been taking your loyalty for granted and playing you for a fool. And thanks for listening to An Average Joe.